I'm Mary Bounds, and I'm the programme convener for the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Royal Society of Edinburgh and what we do, what we're about, and then a few housekeeping things so that we can move on to the main event. So the Royal Society of Edinburgh is Scotland's national academy, and we have quite a bold mission, if you like. Its mission is to advance learning and useful knowledge and support the culture, economic and social well-being of Scotland and its people. So that's quite an ambitious aim. And we deliver independent advice and expertise on a wide variety of subjects. We deliver activities and events to young and old across Scotland and beyond. We're a multidisciplinary academy, which is quite unusual. So we have people from academia, from the sciences, from arts, from law, from business, from the civil service, all teachers, all kinds of people can be members of the academy. And there are 16,000 members at the moment, 16,000 fellows. We also have very good international links, especially with other national academies. So we really appreciate it when we get visits from people who are involved with other academies. Now tonight we've got a very special lecture, and we're looking forward to our very distinguished speaker, Professor Kofi Anyidoho, and he is the President for Arts of the Ghana Academy of Science. So we're very pleased, really pleased to have him here. And he's not going to be doing this on his own. He's brought along some colleagues and friends to provide some poetry and some music and things to go with his presentation. So we're really pleased to have you all here. Now, the lecture has been supported by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, for which we're very grateful, and Alison Phipps has organised everything. She's the UNESCO chair in refugee integration through language and arts of Glasgow University, and she's been really amazing at arranging this event with support from our very, very able events team at the Royal Society of Edinburgh. So I'm now going to hand over to Alison Phipps to introduce the speaker and look after the evening's event. So Alison.
Thank you very much indeed, Mary, and thank you especially to Hannah, who has done such an amazing job behind the scenes, organising, tweeting, all the things that go with organising events at the Royal Society. I think you are in for a treat tonight, ladies and gentlemen, and it is a great pleasure for me to be given the task, a somewhat daunting task, it has to be said, of introducing our speaker to you. Distinguished poet, literary scholar, educator, and cultural activist, Kofi Anyidoho is Professor of Literature and Director of the CODESRIA African Humanities Institute program at the University of Ghana, where he served as the first occupant of the Kwame Nkrumah Chair in African Studies, Director of the School of Performing Arts, and Head of the Department of English. He's been a visiting professor, guest lecturer, and head of the English department, external examiner at various universities across the world. Outside the university, he's deeply involved in various initiatives designed to promote African culture and history. Among them, Ghana Television's African Heritage series, for which he was host and executive producer. He's well known for his unique style of performance poetry and his CDs of recordings of his poetry, both in English and in Ewe. Kofi Anyidoho has published several books of poetry, numerous journal articles and book chapters, and has edited a number of major books on African literature and the humanities. He was president of the African Literature Association based in the United States, and has served on various boards, including the Executive Committee of the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, the National Commission on Culture, and the University of Ghana Council. He's been a member of the sponsoring committee of UNESCO's special project devoted to the ideals of Tagore, Neruda, and César, three of the greatest poets of the 20th century. He was chairman of the Board of Governors of the National Film and Television Institute and chairman of the founding governing body of the University of Health and Allied Sciences in Ho. He's won many prizes for his poetry, including the Falco Fund Literary Award, the Fania Kruger Fellowship for Poetry of Social Vision, the Langston Hughes Prize, the David Nicholl Prize, the BBC Arts and Africa Poetry Award, le Grand Prix de Poésie en langue nationale in Togo for his poetry in Ewe, and the 2015 Millennium Excellence Award, the Literature Prize. He was also author of Akpokplo, a play in English and in Ewe, and Gananya and Agbenoksevi, CD and cassette recordings of his poetry in Ewe. Gananya presents Kofi Anyidoho as a singer-poet whose voice alternates with that of his late mother, Abla Adidi Anyidoho, herself a poet and cantor in the Ewe oral tradition. He holds a BA Honours in English and Linguistics from the University of Ghana, Legon, an MA in Folklore from Indiana University, Bloomington, and a PhD in Comparative Literature from the University of Texas at Austin. He's a fellow and current Vice President for Arts of the National Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's also a rice farmer. Kofi, miado wezo, nawo ple, jijo ga cho, mia pwa jima.
Talvinho venye vlalu, Gemejanio venye zorodo, Nyevla, kaka, Gemejanio venye zorodo. Novinho venye vlalu, Gemejanio venye zorodo, Yezorodo, kemejanyu venyezoro. Mebenalia oleke, 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 oleke. Ebadi dometo, oleke, oleke. Mebenalia oleke, 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 oleke. Ebadi dometo, oleke, oleke, oleke. This presentation focuses on three narratives of the enslavement of African people, narratives that take us back and forth across the Atlantic, linking the diaspora to continental Africa in an intricate pattern of cross-fertilisations. All three texts demonstrate many ways in which brutal historical experiences may be redeemed by the transforming power of the creative imagination. The first text is a two-part video dialogue with Paul Medellin, originally recorded in Accra in 1999 for Ghana Television, in which the Holland-based Surinamese master storyteller performs two evocative oral recreations of slavery, translated, or rather transposed, into the medium of the traditional folk tale. The second text is Isidore Okpeho's novel, Call Me by My Rightful Name, a complex and haunting narrative of the tormented ancestral voice seeking to reclaim its interrupted ritual chant across the oceans and centuries into a diaspora made nameless and restless with imposed and ill-fitting identities. The third text is Menu Hepstein's novel, Ama, a story of the Atlantic slave trade, a complex narrative that takes us through the full and bewildering sweep of the history of the Atlantic slave trade, from the Sahel regions of West Africa, through the court of the Asante, into the dungeons of the slave forts, across the turbulence of the Atlantic, to the slave auction block, to plantations of persistent rebellion in the face of endless agony, towards ultimate triumph of the human spirit. Central to all three narratives is the significant role that the creative imagination can and has played in documentations of experiences of the transatlantic slave trade. An earlier working title of this paper, The Oral Imagination and Transatlantic Narratives of Slavery, carries theoretical assumptions that we cannot take for granted. The assumption that literary production is primarily a function of the imagination is at best a partial truth once we begin to focus on the complex narratives of slavery we have chosen for this presentation. Even the emphasis on orality needs to be regarded with caution. Perhaps it is best to focus on memory as the essential entry point into the story of slavery and the slave trade. An important lesson is provided for us in the 1998 documentary, perhaps some of you may know this documentary, The Language You Cry In, of which the narrator states as follows: "This is a story of memory, how the memory of a family was pieced together through a song with legendary powers to connect those who sang it with their roots." Another commentator describes The Language You Cry In as, quote, "a timeless story of how people struggle to preserve their memory of who they are against the great odds of time, of distance, distraction, and exile, unquote. One important advantage of using memory as a point of entry into the story of slavery and the slave trade is that this approach narrows the gap between formal historical accounts and literary recreations as narratives of slavery. The point is illustrated for us in an old but still relevant definition of history. History, then, means the world looking back upon itself and storing up memories that are pictures. History is any tale the old world can tell when it starts remembering. It is just the world's memory. This view of history as the world's memory brings literature and history closer than is often considered possible. But it also underscores at least one essential difference, an apparent advantage that literature probably has and may have over history as a social science, literature as art, history as social science. Again, the point is demonstrated in Herbert Butterfield's further elaboration on the definition I just cited above. History can only make her pictures and rebuild the past out of the things she can save from a shipwreck. She will piece together just so much of the Battle of Agincourt as the sea washes up to the shores. The memory of the world is not a bright, shining crystal, but a heap of broken fragments, a few fine flashes of light that break through the darkness. And so, history is full of tales half told and of tunes that break off in the middle. She gives us snatches from the lives of men, a peep at some corner of a battlefield, just enough to make us long for a fuller vision. All history, he concludes, is full of locked doors and of faint glimpses of things that cannot be reached. The three texts we have chosen for this presentation provide ample evidence of the peculiar advantages of the literary artist over the historian. Through the use of the oral or creative imagination, the literary artist is able to find the keys that open those locked doors of memory for a fuller glimpse at those treasures beyond the reach of historians, bound as historians are by the disciplinary obligation to stick to the facts. Those tales have told and those tunes that break off in the middle are able to find fuller expression and in language that breathes new life into an otherwise petrified experience. African and especially African diaspora literatures are filled with many a profound reflection on memory. However, as we find in Ayikwe The Healers, or Fred Degai's award-winning first novel, The Longest Memory, or in Carol Phillips' Higher Ground, or Grace Nichols' I Is a Long-Memoried Woman, the recreative force and power of memory or remembering is often in a constant counterpoint with amnesia and forgetting, described by Carol Phillips as the art of murdering the memory. And yet, what is often labeled as forgetting may actually be a disguise for something even more profound, which is silence. Elsewhere, I have argued that in the collective experience of African people, quite often, it is silence, not word, not language, nor even song, that is a more significant entry point into memory. Silence. A brief footnote. My grandfather-in-law was a man who retired from the colonial police service in 1924. When my wife and I returned from the United States in 1984, we went to see him later, sometime in 1986. As we were leaving, he called us back and turned to his granddaughter. Akosia, when you went overseas, was it to Britain or was it to America? And she said, America. Then he asked, wasn't it to that place that so many of our people were taken many years ago? I said, yes. So, are some of them still there? I say, yes. Then, silence. You see, given his age, when he died a few months later, he was estimated to have lived for 116 or so years. This would have meant that in his youth, he would have experienced or heard stories of what? Members of his community disappearing and never being found again. I suspect that this question has remained with him for the best part of 100 years. Somebody wrote a novel titled 100 Years of Solitude. His case would have been 100 years of silence. Finally, he had opportunity to break that silence and ask his granddaughter for confirmation. The fact that he may never have asked the question before should not make us believe that he had forgotten. That is why one of our poets, Alison Phipps, tells us, in the beginning was not word, but silence, and a future rampant with possibility and word. The first text is a two-part video dialogue with Paul Medellin, originally recorded in Accra in 1999 for Ghana Television, as I've said, in which this Holland-based Surinamese master storyteller performs and discusses two extraordinary oral recreations of slavery transposed into the medium of the traditional folk tale. The second is the Okpeho's Call Me By My Rightful Name. The third, Menu Hepstein's Ama, a story of the Atlantic slave trade. Central to all three narratives is the significant role that the oral imagination can and has played in documentations of experiences of the transatlantic slave trade. The television recording of Paul Medellin's two narratives provide us with examples of authentic oral narratives with primary emphasis on performance. The first narrative presents King Lion and the three dogs. The dogs are compelled to go hunting with King Lion. They play a central role in running down an unfortunate deer to which King Lion gives a final blow. However, when it came to what? Sharing the meat, King Lion arbitrarily allocates to himself the proverbial lion's share. He asked, now how are we going to divide this meat? Then he answers, by the way, who gave the deer the final blow? And the dog said, it was you. I said, then the first piece is mine. Then, by the end, he comes for some reason, the thing was divided into 4 pieces. He claims the first 3 pieces and asks them to cut up the last piece into 4. Claims 3 parts of that, and then gives the last bit to them. Take it home. Don't be greedy. Go and share it with your family. It is clear that this narrative, though presented as an animal tale, is really about the modern day trade or business relations between the world's powerful nations and the so-called developing ones. A relationship in which the weaker ones do most of the work but get very little in return for their labors. This is a narrative in which slavery is perhaps only implied, an apparently ancient folk narrative as a parable for contemporary forms of enslavement among the world's nations. Paul Medellin's second narrative, on the other hand, is a direct and complex tale of slavery, the slave trade and enslavement of African people. It is in part an imaginative reconstruction of Europe's history of discovery, expansion, and empire/colonization. Woven into and around this imaginative history of Europe is a central narrative of Anansi and his engagement with the history of slavery and the slave trade. The Anansi we meet in this narrative, however, is far from the familiar trickster of African folklore. This Anansi is more of a mythical ancestor, half god, half man, one who suffers the full misery of enslavement of African people, but survives and lives to tell its lessons to the children of those lost to the enslavement. Halfway through the narration, Paul Medellin breaks into the following words. And he came to the markets, the slave markets in Suriname. And being there, he was the one who helped us restore the African country. He gave us songs and stories to protect ourselves. And he went with them to the plantations, the villages. Anansi, he was never a slave. He was never a master. He was a counselor, a brother, a friend, an advisor. And this Anansi was the one who gave the brave warriors power so they could run away from the villages and plantations and went into the interior of Suriname. Paul Medellin, who had originally gone to Holland to study electronic engineering. Electronic engineering student turned professional oral artist, represents one of the most powerful connections between Africa and the diaspora. As a master storyteller, his performances are marked by skills that are found only in the most accomplished artists. It's a living testimony of how some aspects of African oral tradition do not only survive in the diaspora, but continue to flourish even till today. Significantly, Paul Medellin inherited his art from his father, who had also learnt it from older members of the family, reminding us of the words of the griot Mamadou Kouyaté, master in the art of eloquence, from whom the historian Diti Nyan recorded his famous version of the Sundiata epic. He had learned the story of Sundiata as he tells us, I am a griot, master in the art of eloquence. I learned my art from my father, who also learned it from his father. The art of eloquence. History has no mystery for us, he says. We are the memory of mankind. We are the memory of mankind. We make a mistake by not paying enough attention to the stories of our own people. We dismiss them as what? Folk tales. Call Me by My Rightful Name, our second selected text, is an unusual work of literature, a complex text that inhabits the crossroads, the borders of several genres and modes of literary or artistic composition. At the level of formal structure, it is at once a novel and an omnibus Ifa suite, a work of literary prose fiction, and a compendium of classic, sometimes archaic oral poetic text. The Yoruba Oriki or Ijala, proverbs, song text, and especially Ifa, the divination poetry of the Yoruba people. The total corpus of Ifa, we are told in the text, is organized into 16 principal verse narratives known as Odu, each of which further multiplies into 16 subcategories, making a set of 256 Odu, each of which may further break down into several sub-verse narratives known as Esse. And by coincidence, more likely by design, the printed text of this novel works out to just a few lines more than 256 pages. In a sense, then, we are invited to read the entire work as an Ifa divination performance, complete with its several layers of coded proverbial symbolic narratives. Another aspect of the complex structure of Call Me by My Rightful Name is to be seen in the many ways in which the verbal text intersects with music, with dance and mime, in what seems to constitute a total art performance. The music, the dance, the mime, like the various forms of ancient poetic text cited above, must be seen as more than mere embellishments. Indeed, fragmentary and momentary as they often appear, graphically marked in print as italics, they constitute a powerful undercurrent of suppressed voices and images that are constantly, persistently seeking revelation and an open hearing. The eruptions of these suppressed voices into the otherwise smooth flow of the prose narrative constitute some of the most dramatic, often poignant moments in the entire text. Given the complexity and depth of knowledge of Yoruba and other oral traditions that is evident in this work, it is clear that this is the kind of work that can only be produced by a writer with considerable knowledge of the tradition. And as it turns out, the author, Isidore Kweho, the novelist, happens also to be a preeminent scholar of African oral traditions, author of such major texts as The Epic in Africa, Myth in Africa, Once Upon a Kingdom, and the widely used texts, Oral Performance in Africa. Indeed, there are several moments in the text when the narrator or one character's explanation of unfamiliar situations and even text to another character may be recognized as a creative seminar session on African oral tradition. The stylistic, textual, and structural complexity of Call Me by My Rightful Name is an appropriate vehicle for the complex often disturbing but ultimately triumphant narrative of slavery it carries. And it is the story of Otis, the central character, known in U.S. basketball circles as Tiger, later nicknamed in Africa as Tokumbo, who finally reclaims his rightful ancestral name, Akimboale. Otis, son of relatively comfortable middle-class African-American parents, is riding high as a star, a superstar in fact, in collegiate basketball in the U.S. of the early years of the civil rights movement. Despite the rising racial consciousness and its accompanying tensions, like his parents, the past or Africa for Otis is, quote, another country he does not intend to visit, unquote. Otis, like his parents, was not aware of Ifa's warning in that major proverbial line, the path to the fathers can never be erased. But one night, at the height of his basketball glory, a voice speaks to him in a language, or rather, as he put it, in a strange language. Ifa divination was performed for Oyepolu. He was told it was because he had ignored the ancestral rites that his life was in disarray. He was told to visit his ancestral shrine and pay his respects. Once he did that, life would be good for him again. He did as he was told. Things became well for him. Oyepolu did as he was told, perhaps because he understood that Ifa's voice could not be easily put aside. Otis, on the other hand, did not understand. He in fact did not know a thing about Ifa, so he thought the voice was no more than a bad nightmare from which he would wake up, and in good time. But in no time, Otis's life falls into what? Disarray, as the voice not only returns again and again, but he himself begins to simulate that voice and dance to its music, all in trance. Otis is persuaded by his parents to consult first a psychiatrist and then a linguist, surrogates for what we would have called back home the Babalao, the priest of Ifa. Surprisingly, both of them perform their own kind of divination, which we call consultation and analysis, and come to the same conclusion as Ifa. Ifa says, your life is in disarray because you ignored the ancestral right. Both the linguist and the psychiatrist tell Otis to trace his ancestral steps back to Nigeria. So this was how come Otis, his father, the psychiatrist, find their way back to Yoruba land in Africa. Otis discovers, with a sense of shock but ultimate relief, that the strange text that he has been reciting in his trances is the very same text his great-grandfather, Akimboale, was reciting in the midst of a funeral rite for his father, Akindiji, when the ritual was interrupted and he was captured and carried away into slavery. Let me go over that bit. That Otis began experiencing what nobody seemed to understand, especially often triggered by the sound of the drum, the African drum. Suddenly he'll go into this. First, the voice was speaking to him almost like in a dream. Then in waking moments, the voice can speak to him especially when he heard an African drum. Then he'll start dancing. And then he'll start reciting the chant himself. What was eventually revealed was that this was the last bit of a chant that his ancestor was reciting at the funeral of his father when slavery days broke in on him in the forest and carried him away. I don't know, 200 years later, Otis is reciting these chants and dancing to them. Terrible as this discovery is, it also carries an element of hope. It is the ailment you cannot diagnose that has the best chance of destroying you. Once you discover the nature and cause of your ailment, half the cure is achieved. It does not take too long for Otis, now known as Akimbowale by his rightful name, to put his life back in order. So the story of Otis Akimbowale Hampton, like a classic Ifa tale, is a modern day story of every descendant of enslaved Africans. It is the story of his own father, Otis Jeremiah Hampton, the story of his mother, Melba Abigail Warfield, and the story of Aunt Ella, who wanted so much to make the journey back to Africa. The story of Otis's Jamaican-born fiancée, Norma, and of Guinea man of maroon ancestry. But in the end, it is also the story of every African who was spared by the troubled history of the slave trade to remain on the ancestral land of Africa. The story of Otis's soul guide, Babalao Akinwumi. The story of the arch-enemy, Crabs, and his long line of traitors, betrayers. Otis's story is indeed the story of his great ancestor, Itayemi, and his great-grandfather, Akindiji. Above all, it is the amazing story of the twin sisters of his great-grandfather, Taiwo and Kehinde, who lived so long that the village sees no need of any history beyond them, more valued in the oral memory of the people than the combined wisdom of successive rulers of the feats of the brave. This is their story, for it is they who lived long enough to put the fractured tale back together. For Otis, lost brother Akimbowale, who the gods have guided back home to complete the interrupted ritual, so their revered father spirit can rest in peace, so that their own life and the life of their community can achieve final resolution. Reluctantly, almost regretfully, Otis Akimbowale Hampton returns home, and home is in quotes, to the diaspora, but not until he has stayed long enough to lead his ancestral community through a long overdue struggle to dislodge the men who are driven by greed to inflict division and misery on their own people. When Otis returned home to what was clearly his ancestral community, the chief and his elders assembled, and he told his story, and he repeated the chant. The chief said, "No, we don't know anything about this." Then there was one elder at the back. He said, "Tell the boy the truth. Tell him the truth. You know, tell him the truth." Why? Because it was the chief's ancestors who betrayed Otis's ancestor into slavery. when this finally came, and Otis stayed long enough to learn the language to perform the rite, he could have gone back home, but he said, no, these traitors must be dealt with. The youth were ready to be led to drive them out. And Otis stayed and presided over that cleansing, driving that chief from the stool and paving the way for a new line of leaders, hopefully who may not want to betray their own people all over again. To fully appreciate the necessity, there's an important point here. Why must Otis go back to America? This was the time of the civil rights movement. This problem has to be tackled as a transatlantic project, because it was created by a coalition of transatlantic global capital adventurers. So he goes back to play his part in the civil rights movement. To fully appreciate the necessity for this global view of the problem of slavery, the slave trade and enslavement of African people, we must turn to Menu Hepstein's magnificent and disturbing and yet hopeful novel, Amma, a story of the Atlantic slave trade. Like Otis's tale, the narrative pursues Amma through a lifetime of several incarnations. We first meet her as a young teenager, Nancy, who is left at home to look after her little brother, Nowu, as their parents walk to the next village for a neighbor's funeral. She is captured by slave raiders, raped, and carried away on horseback. A search and rescue party mobilized by her lover, Ito, is overwhelmed by the vicious and better armed troops of the invaders, leaving a trail of dead bodies behind, among them Nanji's beloved Ito, whose head is crushed under the hoof of a horse galloping away from the scene of tragedy. We catch up with Nancy at the fabulously wealthy court of the Asante, where she is given as a present to the Queen Mother, Konedu Yadom, who promptly endows her with a proper Asante name, Amma, because she arrives in the royal household on a Saturday. The glory, by the time we finish reading this section on the Asante, Amma's time at the heart of the Asante Empire, we cannot help coming to certain conclusions. That the glory of Asante is truly amazing, but it is glory encircled by nightmares and pools of blood, not only for the countless victims of their violent wars, but also for themselves, king and queen mother alike. Death, often violent death, lies in ambush along the royal corridors of the Asante king. His regular victims may be the slaves, the enslaved, but they may also be royal wives and princes, as well as he himself. He is not beyond the reach of death in a palace doomed to treachery in the pursuit of power and boundless wealth. Those who beat the constant drums of war and wade through blood to climb their royal stools and thrones must beware the slippery stairs filled with blood and with slime of their victims, and with often rotten leftovers from royal feasts. Incredibly, Nancy, now Amma, survives the unimaginable slaughter of human beings, beginning with the king's favorite and resident wives, that follows the death of Nana Osekwajo, fourth Asante king. Amma survives the slaughter, but only with the help of a fellow slave called Esi. Indeed, it is true as Ifa says, that one hand alone cannot lift a water gourd to the head. One foot alone is unstable on a bridge. That is why pigeons walk in pairs. The proverbial way of what? Ifa divination poetry. States it and leaves you to decode it. One hand alone cannot lift a water gourd to the head. One foot alone is unstable on a bridge. That is why pigeons always walk in pairs. Amma survives, but only to be delivered into another phase of the enslaved African's life of agony. The adolescent king, Nana Osekwajo, falls in love with Amma, a slave, and proposes to make her not only his first, but only wife. The elders, of course, are scandalized. And to avert what they consider to be an abomination, the royal elders conspire and falsely accuse Amma of theft, put her on a bogus trial, and sentence her to death. But the Queen Mother, Konedu Yadom, in her royal kindness, persuades the elders to grant her a royal reprieve and commit the death sentence to transportation into the human cargo of the slave fort at Elmina on the Atlantic coast. As with the two earlier phases of her enslavement, the beginning of this third phase is also marked by the violence and humiliation of rape. Rape by her new master, the governor. Governor De Bruyne, predictably, it is also marked by an involuntary transformation of her identity as the governor renames her Pamela. Remember the title of what? Okpeho's novel, Call Me by My Rightful Name. Nancy becomes Amma, Amma becomes Pamela. What else is waiting? Against all the odds, Nancy, renamed Amma, renamed Pamela, finds favor with the untypical governor who, like Nana Osekwajo, falls in love with her. And for a full year and more, Nancy Amma Pamela is blessed with probably the happiest moment of her troubled life. She even begins to look forward to the possibility of a life of liberty beyond the generosity of her unlikely lover. Amma makes the mistake of forgetting that she is still a slave whose life is dedicated to endless misery, a fact of which she is soon reminded by Jensen, the governor's cruel successor, when the governor suddenly dies of yellow fever. Having spent most of her life in the castle, in the spacious and airy comfort of the governor's apartments upstairs, the encounter with the dungeons into which Jensen throws her with the other captives should have been enough to push her off the cliff. And yet again, Nancy Amma Pamela survives. She survives, but only to be ushered into the next phase of her life as an enslaved woman, the Middle Passage. Generations of African and African heritage writers have taken us again and again to what they see as the most difficult stage of the journey into chaos, the Middle Passage. And as one scholar tells us, the Middle Passage was the key, turning the memory lock. The ocean was a destroyer, a supreme separator of body from soil, spirit from soul, mind from source. We have experienced the horrors of the Middle Passage in Charles Johnson's unforgettable novel of the same name. And we can think of countless other depictions of these horrors. Still, we must count Menu Epstein's narrative description detailing of these horrors in his novel as something special, something truly unforgettable. Each character he selects for specific focus is given his or her full measure of inhumanity and or humaneness. Never for one moment are we as readers allowed to forget that every participant in this tale of horror must be accountable as an individual, not a mere unnamed figure in one of the most sordid moments in human history. The punishment visited on Amma and Tomba following the failed rebellion they led on the slave ship, a slave ship mischievously named for the love of liberty. Their rebellion, even though it failed, must still stand as the ultimate in the survival of human cruelty. But it is also a measure of the endless possibilities of human endurance. If we are surprised at the joking relationship that emerges between the enslaved Africans and their Middle Passage tormentors once they land in Bahia in Brazil, it may be because we fail to understand that the desire for freedom is an irrepressible dimension of our full humanity. And in order to maintain a hold on our humanity, we must learn not only to fight, but also learn to laugh our way through the defeats we suffer as we wage our struggles against enslavement. By the time Amma and her newfound soulmate, Tomba, settled down to the final phase of their enslavement on the plantations, it is already clear that ultimate victory is on their side. Life on the sugar mill may be bitter as hell, but Amma's spirit has fully matured enough to withstand her final humiliation at the hands of the slave master, her new last master. Matured enough to enable her lend a helping hand to Tomba as he exerts his ultimate revenge. Matured enough to enable her reconcile herself to Tomba's execution. Indeed, matured enough for her to finally settle down in her mind and tell the full story of her life to her son, Kwame Zumbi, who in turn will one day tell the story to his daughter, Nancy Amma. She has no doubt that all will be well, because in the end, Kwame is a free man. It hasn't come easy, but the circle of endless agony and occasional triumph is complete. Amma's spirit is ready to be released, and it will fly like a bird back over the sea, back to Africa. She calls across the waters, "Tabista, my mother, Tigan, my father, prepare a place for me. I beg you, prepare a place for me." Even as she holds on to what is left of that cloth Tabista gave her, something torn and new, the only thing she has left of Africa, all except her spirit. And as she awaits that final moment, we recall with her father the image of the Catholic priest of the Elmina Castle, who gave her English lessons but failed to make her a Catholic. We are troubled by the apparition of the Fanti priest Philip Kweku of the Cape Coast Castle, who, as Amma remembered, could not decide whether he was African or English. As Amma's spirit rises gently into the shadows, we hear her in the mind filled with what? Words, the words. The love of liberty. Repeated again and again. The love of liberty. The love of liberty. The love of liberty. Love of liberty. Of liberty. 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 How do we measure? How can we measure what it takes to survive enslavement? The lessons of these three transatlantic narratives of slavery point us to several possibilities. For want of time, we must focus on just three: memory, language, unity. We've already spoken at some length about memory. The need to hold on to the memory of who we were before the onset of our traumatized life of enslavement. The need to keep in view the memory of what we did wrong, if any, and especially the memory of those among us who lent a hand to the outsiders, the enslavers. The need never to forget that we have been overpowered and shackled time and time again, but we have always struggled to redeem our sense of dignity and pride. Like Anansi, like Tomba, like Ama, like Akindiji, like Akimbowale, we need to fight against the loss of memory. Why? Because, as one writer tells us, quote, "The long road to amnesia begins when a man is forced to view the rape of his women, the dismantling of his family and nation, the forceful sprinkling of his children worldwide, and the occupation of his land by foreigners unlike any people he has known. How does a woman survive the castration of her men, the loss of her insides, and the detachment from all that was beautiful and meaningful to her without mental dislocation? What happens to the mind that experiences family dismemberment and the distribution of its members into the services of another race for life? The choices after defeat were limited. And what confirmed the limitation was when one was forced into the holds of ships in spaces that crippled the body and then transported thousands of miles under incredible conditions that were designed to destroy the spirit with each mile traveled from the land of one's beginning. The crowning blow was to be unloaded in strange ports among even stranger people and systematically traumatized into a different and ugly way of life. In order to survive, one had to give up something. And if that something was not the body, the only explainable substitute was the mind. It goes, snaps like steel under intense heat. The mind, once fire and light, snaps under the force of the ocean and darkness, seeking peace in forgetfulness. A long quotation from Haki Madhubuti, the African-American poet and scholar. But in order to keep our memory intact, we must pay attention to the factor of language. Like Otis, we must come to an early understanding that, quote, "There is nothing anyone can do unless we deal with the language question. Everything hangs on it." And it is not for nothing that in almost all our tales of slavery and enslavement, one of the most important first steps taken by the enslaver is to ensure that the captives are not only given new names, their master's name, but also a new language, their master's language. That is why we learn that some of the most severe punishments reserved for the enslaved are administered to those who insist on calling themselves by their rightful name and recounting their experiences in their own language. This loss of language is indeed the beginning of the loss of self. Those of you who have read Alex Haley's book or watched the film, you will remember the scene in which the central character is given a new name. Say, my name is Toby. I say, no, but I am Kunta Kinte. And then the whipping goes on until he had to, okay, so I am Kunta Kinte. Except that he never let go. I'm rather Toby. Except that he never let go of what? Kunta Kinte. And when he had the blessing of having a child, a young girl, the moment the girl could speak, could understand, he takes him aside in one of those rare moments. You see, they call me Toby. But as they will say on that side, that ain't my real name. I am Kunta Kinte. Can you repeat that? Kunta Kinte. What is my real name? Kunta Kinte. And I come from a faraway place in Africa, near a big river known as Kambi Bolongo. Kambi Bolongo, the local name for River Gambia. And what we have known is that the diaspora people who have been able to trace their roots to their ancestral homes, in almost all cases, the key is what? In the name, the original name of the ancestor, and the language, the name of the place. I define the colonizing period as a moment in Europe's history when he went around discovering places and renaming all of them in his own image. That is why when I visited Zimbabwe and I saw how immediately after independence, Zimbabwe was what? Renaming all the places that had been renamed by the colonizers. The death blow that signaled undeniable defeat occurred quite by surprise, says Hakim Adubuti. Not even the elders could speak the language of their foreparents, and with the killing of language, the transfiguration of the African was complete and lasting. Few things are as important as language, and for most, the quieting of the tongue, more than anything else, sealed their faith in the New World. For without language, one cannot express the indigenous self, and therefore one has nothing to express other than the selves of others in their language. By the way, there is a documentation indicating that slaves who insisted on speaking their original language attracted the most severe punishment. There was a special device, iron, that they would use to what? Clamp your mouth. So you don't say a word until you are ready to start speaking the master's language. It should come to us as no surprise that for Otis to reclaim his rightful name, he must return to his ancestral land to complete the interrupted ritual his ancestor was engaged in at the time of his capture into bondage. But to complete that ritual, he must first learn the language, and to really develop native competence in his ancestral language, he must heed the advice of his teacher and soul guide, Babalawo Akinwumi. And quoting the Babalawo, that it is all right for me to want to learn the language of this place, but I must remember that language does not exist by itself. Language is nourished by life, and in turn nourishes that life. So to understand a language in all its dimensions and be able to speak it well, you must interact intimately with the life and the culture around it. Otis's road to recovery begins the moment he makes the following resolution: I will learn this language and speak it well and do whatever it takes to make me the person I ought to be. Unquote. As readers, we recognize that Otis's initial frustration and eventual trauma hang on his inability to understand the language he cries in during those moments of his ancestral possession. We also recognize, on the other hand, that Ama's survival may owe a great deal to her innate intelligence and strength of character, but also in a large measure due to her incredible facility with language. At every sensitive moment of her precarious life, her way with words comes in handy as it opens for her doors that remain closed to others. Above all, beyond a spirit endowed with abundant kindness, her tremendous usefulness to other enslaved Africans is very much facilitated by her multilingual skills. The last factor that I mentioned earlier is unity. Memory, language, unity. This unity may and has often been blamed for the sorrows of enslavement, and the human weakness of greed and selfishness are often cited as factors responsible for disunity. For these narratives of slavery, however, we observe that even with all the best fellow feeling and comradeship in the world, even with the greatest common purpose, unity of action is impossible without communication through a language of common heritage and of mutual intelligibility. Ama's most grievous failure in her long struggle against enslavement occurs when the uprising that she directs with the help of Tomba on their slave ship fails, largely because Tomba does not understand the tactical instruction she whispers to him, asking him to move quickly and quietly to take Captain William hostage. Often, too often, the life of the enslaved hangs on language. The enslaved African's soul, Ori, can only come into its own when it is properly identified, acknowledged in a language native to her or his personality. Our colleague, Nigerian poet and critic, tells us as follows: the name opens the door to the house of being. It is the readiest, most direct channel to a person's Ori, and all it stands for in the liturgy of existence. The Yoruba believe that to endow something with a name is to give it life beyond subsistence. This world did not exist until a word existed in which its name was found. The world itself was evoked into being by the proclamation of that name. To live is to have a name. To have a name is to live. I'd like to wind up. That there are unresolved challenges awaiting researchers into African history and culture. Among them is a challenge of developing a new kind of literacy, the ability and skills to read and interpret the drum and the dance. Even if we are able to read the drum and the dance, there is still the other challenge of how to write and print these ancient modes or codes of human communication. The challenge is real and perplexing, but it is not necessarily beyond a possible solution. However, as we find in Okpeho's novel, it will require the combined skills and efforts of a psychologist, the linguist, the historian, the literary scholar, and the musicologist. But these specialists by themselves together may not get very far without the crucial input of various experts within the oral, non-scribal traditions themselves. Experts such as Babalao Akinwumi, master teacher to Otis, or the slave driver who effortlessly, almost casually, interprets the language of the drums to Amma as they approach the royal palace. God is dumb till the drum speaks, says historian and poet Kamau Brathwaite. Perhaps that is why among the Akan, the ultimate voice of history and ancestral memory belongs to the master drummer, the Odoman Kumachrema, the divine drummer, to whom even the Asante king must pay due respect. We are dancer and the dance. Time before memory, memory beyond time. We harvest tears from laughter's eyes. We even sow some joy in sorrow's deepest soul. Jizigandure aguna gavajelu, jizigandure mi aguna gavajelu, jizigandure mi guna gavajelu, jizigandure mi aguna gavajelu, jizigandure mi aguna gavajelu. There is darkness still in our mind, but dawn cannot be too far behind. There is darkness still in our mind, but dawn cannot be too far behind. Jiziganduremi aguna gavajelu, Jiziganduremi aguna gavajelu, Jiziganduremi aguna gavajelu, Jiziganduremi aguna gavajelu. Thank you very much for it.
Just going to, yes, this bends. Kofi, thank you so much. It's Black History Month, and it's a month we're very uneasy about. We don't quite know what to say. We don't quite know what the right words would be for things for which we need to learn some silence and some humility. And I think today, with your transatlantic narratives of slavery, you've begun to maybe offer us a glimpse of the way that the imagination can indeed be a creative force and a transforming power. We do have a few moments for questions, so could I ask you, if you do have questions, to put your hand up and wait till somebody holding a mic comes to you, and then to hold the mic quite close to your mouth so that we can hear you. So are there any questions for Kofi at this moment?
I'll be glad if the response is silence. That can also be very meaningful. But yes, I'll respond to any. Yes.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk in terms of the historical journey from Africa to the Caribbean. I regard myself as a descendant of this history, and I liked and it sets in a little bit of confusion for me, because you talk about the name, and in Shakespeare it says, well, what's in a name? A rose is a rose, by any other name.
Yeah, that name.
And for me, I can't remember my African name, and I've got another name, which was given to me, as you've said, and therefore the dilemma I find is, how much loyalty do I give to the names? Because that's the name I'm born with. This is the name of my time. So what should I do with it? And what I'd like you to do is to answer that in terms of the African concept and the descendants of slaves concept.
Let me tell you that your dilemma is not limited to the people in the Caribbean or the diaspora. It's the same back home on the continent. Can you believe it that I went through primary school with a burden of carrying a Christian name which was Christian? And I woke up one morning and said, I don't need it anymore. I already had a name the day I was born. I was born on a Friday. I'm male, so I'm Kofi. That's it. As for my grandfather's name, hey, it's a piece of poem. Anyidoho, Manyatatamo. When the honeybees gather and form a hive, it is not easy bypassing them to harvest the honey. Anybody who throws that name away has created a problem for himself. And there is no reason why you couldn't reclaim it somehow. We've been involved in a festival in Ghana known as Panafest. Almost all those who come from the diaspora are offered an opportunity one evening to choose a name. At least one of those you don't have to worry about. All you need to know is to check your date of birth and find out which day of the week you were born. If you were male and you were born on Friday, then of course you are Kofi. If you were born on Saturday, then of course you are Kwame or Ama, as in the novel we talked about. It is possible to change it, and several people from the diaspora have done that. I was quoting liberally from someone known as Hakim Adubuti. If you check his early publications, they were all published under the slave master's name. The slave masters played God. You see, when God, according to the good book, finished creating something, he stepped back, looked at it. When he was convinced that it's good, then what did he do? You give it a name. By renaming places and people, the European enterprise was preparing the way forward, claiming ownership of those people and places. The way you name your child when your child is born. Otherwise, if he doesn't carry your name, she or he doesn't carry your name, is it not possible and that somebody else could suggest that it may not probably have been your child? The short answer is that some have done it. I quoted Kamau Brathwaite. Brathwaite, otherwise originally known as what? He was a famous scholar and had a name that he carried with him. until when he went to Kenya, spent time in Kenya. There was a formal ceremony in which he took the name Kamau. In the same way that among many Africans, when a baby is born, there is a formal ceremony in which he or she is given a name or names. So I don't know that that is a big problem that cannot be solved. Many have done it. I see you have gray hair, but it's not too late. It's just a simple ceremony. But above all, you can spare your children that difficulty. Yeah. My children were baptized. When our second daughter was ready for baptism, I was not anxious for it to happen, but the mother was keen. And the priest said, "What name are you going to give her?" I said, "What do you mean?" She has a name already. If you cannot baptize her on the name she already has, then I'm afraid this ceremony will not happen. And the priest had to give in. I said, "You see, your problem is that you don't even understand the significance of the name we've given her. Akofa. If we were to find an English equivalent for it, solace. And there is a good reason why I named her Akofa. She was born roughly just about 9 months after my mother's death. And I named her Akofa, solace. And you want to change it and call her Christina or something else. So there is a meaning to names, significance to names.
There was another question just there. Yeah.
My question is there in Ghana a formal effort to support the local languages? My experience, I have discovered in Scotland there is Gaelic, which is brought up, and I also have spoken with Gaelic speaker who explained to me why it is important, and it refers roughly what you have said. It keeps the collective memory. And is it in Ghana something done today, nowadays, an effort to?
We've been going back and forth on it. At the level of policy, the level of government policy of education. Interestingly, the politicians, when it's time for campaign, they do most of their campaign in our languages. But when you tell them that we need to teach our children, to ensure that our children speak our languages, they don't. They are reluctant to make it a policy. So you want to start teaching the Ghanaian child mathematics, science, geography, using what? A language he or she is yet to what? To learn. This is part of the crisis of education. There was an experiment in Nigeria, the Yoruba language experiment, where they had two groups of what? Kids from primary school. For one group, they used Yoruba as the language of instruction for all subjects, including English. The other group, they started them with English as language of instruction. At the end of it, this group was performing better in every language, every subject, including English. One of the reasons why I fell in love with literature was simply that the policy at the time made it possible for me to first read Shakespeare in Ewe. Shakespeare had been translated into Ewe. Julius Caesar, Macbeth, all these. I first read Russian literature in Ewe, Tolstoy. I first read, French literature in Ewe. And as a young kid, those texts have stayed with me ever since. But our planners are a bit confused about it, partly because they themselves have forgotten that when they went to school in those days, they were started in their own languages. But, we keep going back and forth on it.
Thank you. I have my eye on the time. I know there's a few more questions, but I also have my eye on Hannah, who's the real boss, who's just indicating we're coming to the end of our time together. So I'd like to move to propose a vote of thanks. And we're going to do this slightly differently. I think, Kofi, you've challenged us a lot to think about our own history and the way we tell the story of our own history, and the history that is our history that we don't teach in our schools and in our colleges, in our curriculum and our universities. There has been much that for many of us in the audience has been very strange and different and unknown, and that is a responsibility we bear in the way that we shape our curriculum and the lives of our children and the lives of our young people and the lives of our students. And we live in an uneasy age, and so maybe just to change the way we usually do a vote of thanks, I'm going to invite my colleagues Tawana Sitole, Gamali Todro, and also my friend and colleague Deborah Kayembe, who is a fellow of the Young Academy here at the Royal Society of Edinburgh, to do this jointly, to have a merging of voices of poetry and of the continent of Africa here in this capital city in Scotland. Thank you. Kofi, you said that your father-in-law said, "Are some of them still there?" History, you said, can only rebuild from what can be saved from the shipwreck. Flashes of light that break through the darkness. Literature, you said, can find a key that opens the locked doors of memory and a fuller vision. Are some of them still there? Silence. In the beginning was not word, but silence. He gave us songs, you said, stories to protect ourselves, a counselor, brother, friend, advisor. He gave us the power to run away. A master in the arts of eloquence, history has no mystery for us. We are memory. Are some of them still there? Call me by my rightful name. Otis, in disarray, seeking respect, paying respect, and then the sound of a drum in a dream, because terrible discoveries carry an element of hope. And here is the story of every African, the amazing story. Here is betrayal. Here are the Transatlantic global capital adventurers. Here is the new line of leaders. Here are civil rights. Glory, you said. Glory, the Asante glory, is encircled in nightmare and pools of blood. One hand alone, you said, cannot lift a gourd to the head. In rape, in violence, in humiliation, Nanzi, Amma, Pamela. In the middle passage, that key again, turning the memory. body torn from soil, spirit torn from soul, mind from life. For the love of liberty, for the love of liberty, liberty, but now matured enough to tell the full story, the full story, the full story, because God is dumb until the drum speaks. And with her spirit rising in the body, for the love of liberty, for the love of liberty, the love of liberty, for love, for liberty. Are some of them still there? Are some of them still there? Are they still there? Are they still there? Wezo. Are they still there? Wezo. Wezo.
Honorable Professor Kofi Anyidoho, Madam Chairwoman, our most valued guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. On behalf of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the entire team who have worked so hard to organize this event, let me call it the fraternity of humanity here together. On my own behalf, I extend a very worthy thank to you, Professor, for gracing your important work and sharing with us your findings and opinion today. A big thank you to you, Kofi Anyidoho, son of Ghana, great poet of Iwi, oral artist, for your tremendous contribution to an effort to our African literature, heritage, and humanity. As for today, let us remember for eternity that Professor Kofi Anyidoho, one of the many guardians of the African spirit, has come to a way of healing the African people's wounds. From freedom screaming from the mountainside of Scotland to the riverside of Tano River in Ghana, let us call for friendship on our two great nations. Finally, I would like to have this opportunity to place a rock of thanks to Anna, who is the event officer here at the Royal Society of Edinburgh, for the perfect logistic support and guidance that she has extended to all us on this occasion. Madam Chairwoman, ladies and gentlemen, I want to state that we are most grateful to our speaker tonight, and thank you for being with us this evening. It has been a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Dai dai muri yangu mambo, ati dai dai wana wangu mambo, dai dai muri yangu mambo, dai dai muri yangu kugana mambo, dai dai muri yangu kugana mambo. Dai dai wana wangu mambo, dogarire ika mambo, dogarire ika mambo, dogarire ika mambo, dogarire paka uya wanu kuzara pasi, vamwe vana kofi kuzara pasi. vamwe vana Alison kuzara pasi, vamwe vana Hana kuzara pasi, vamwe vana Mary kuzara pasi, vamwe vana Debra kuzara pasi, vamwe vana Gameli kuzara pasi. Nagarire ikamambo, nagarire ikamambo, nagarire ikamambo, nagarire ikamambo, nagarire